We're seeing a federal push to get rid of the Department of Education. So, where did these ideas about block grants back to the states, reverse discrimination because of diversity, equity, inclusion, and wasteful spending come from? Now, you might be thinking Project 2025, but in fact, today we're going to talk about Ronald Wilson Reagan. We're going to talk about the history of Republican support and opposition to the Department of Education and kind of how we got here in the first place. I'm Dr. Kara. I'm a school psychologist, and I'm here to tell you about some history with the Department of Education. So, just to set the stage, in 1979, President Carter had developed the Department of Education back into a cabinet level position after it had just been a sub-cabinet position of the Department of the Interior after segregationists had demoted it to that level. So we had this idea that states needed more accountability towards the federal government to provide equal opportunity to education for students across the country. However, we see just a year later, in 1980, Ronald Reagan campaigned on abolishing the Department of Education, saying that it was wasteful, that it was just an amalgamation of federal programs that were not lawful, that having a federal push for busing and reintegration into schools was reverse discrimination and a failed social experiment, and that we should just be providing block grants of funding to the states. So in 1982, Reagan did his State of the Union address, and in his budget plan that he was proposing, they would have major savings. They would build efficiency, for example, if they got rid of the Department of Education. Now, this failed because they had a Democratic House of Representatives that pushed back on this. And in 1984, they largely abandoned the idea of abolishing the Department of Education because it just wasn't popular. And so we saw this pushback. We saw this end of this idea of getting rid of the Department of Education. And we don't see it picked up again really until President Trump. So we see the next Republican president is George H.W. Bush, and he wanted to be the education president. In fact, he had a summit in 1989 that brought all the governors together across the country to talk about how to build better federal education policy. We are seeing that there was a lack of standards, that kids were not getting equal access to education, and some states were providing weaker standards for education than others. This group got together and made some goals that would eventually become America 2000. This idea that by 2000, children across the country would be able to meet certain standards, like being first in the world in math and science education, graduation rate of 90%. All of these things that we would agree is probably really good for America to achieve. This plan wouldn't pass, but then the Clinton administration would pass something similar in their years as well. So we see that instead of dismantling the Department of Education, Bush number one actually tried to boost it. They wanted to improve the Department of Education. And so we see that after Clinton, Bush the second would also try to boost the national level of education. With the Department of Education, he implemented No Child Left Behind, and that led to a lot of benefits in education. We saw that we had more research towards reading initiatives and more funding for that research. We saw that we wanted that he implemented more Pell Grants for low income students to go to college, loan forgiveness for teachers, and again, this idea of accountability of the states to the federal Department of Education was pretty apparent. Not all states were reporting data on student achievement to what we now call the nation's report card. So data was incomplete, and we weren't even sure what the results were across all states of how children were improving in reading and math. So he made sure that we have all of that available to us. And what's interesting is Reagan said that, all of these practices were reverse discrimination. Busing was a bad idea and a failed social experiment. But then we see George W. Bush talking about how Black and Hispanic children, minority children, were the ones who were suffering the most from poor accountability in education. So we see not only is the Bush era education focusing on that national level, the federal Department of Education, but also citing minority students as ones that we want to help improve their schools the most. So, this is kind of the trajectory that we see of everybody kind of valuing this idea of a federal Department of Education. Now, these policies aren't perfect by any means. Both Bushes really liked school choice. I'm not for school choice. I think it takes a lot of money from the federal pot, from state pots of education, and puts it towards private schools instead of those public education institutions. Now, there's also a lot of problems with standardized achievement testing. This idea of teaching to the test instead of teaching skills is not great. And there was funding problems, of course. But we see that there is a value of this federal educational institution, and that if we don't hold the states accountable to a federal Department of Education, that they might simply not do the things that they need to do to make sure education is strong in their states for all kids. And so now we are seeing a whole change in direction from the Bush era back to the Ronald Reagan era for the Department of Education with the Trump administration. They're bringing back these ideas of reverse discrimination, of block grants to the states. It's all kind of along that trajectory that we saw in the 80s. And I hope what we'll see is some pushback on this Ronald Reagan era policy on getting rid of the Department of Education. There's a lot of schools that get title funding, for example, through the Department of Education that provides high quality teachers to low income areas, especially rural areas. It can be hard to attract teachers to those schools when urban districts or more wealthy districts can just pay teachers more. And with cost of living rising, teachers need to be able to eat, they need to be able to pay rent. And having federal funding to attract teachers to lower income districts is a big positive. So I think we'll see some pushback on this. I hope we see some pushback on this from people on all sides of the aisle. And I think we'll see that, like Linda McMahon said, our lovely department secretary, this has to go through Congress. It can't just be executive ordered away. And I think we'll see some pushback on it. And I hope we do. As a school psychologist, I know how this money and this accountability measure helps schools across our country and helps kids across our country. Now, if you want to hear more information about this, keep in touch. I'll be following it pretty closely. Again, I'm Dr. Kara. I'm a school psychologist, and I really care about public education. So follow me here on YouTube, or if you're on TikTok, follow me there too. So, y'all have a good day.